Okay, I mean, see, coming to petrochemicals, or for that matter, there is this clarity that, you can lead to various kinds of products, or you can lead to chemicals, and typically what happens in business is that you are looking at the demand side of it, and you are trying to cater to that. But what I would, in this context, like to also point out is that which is basically taking an extension of what Mr. Bansal said. See, if we really want to be self-sufficient, or if we really want to be, I mean, it is encompassing any particular product, outlook, or any particular kind of a technology outlook. What happens basically is that in addition to R&D in our country, there is one lacking feature, that is taking technology to marketplace. That is this effort to make it commercially viable. The appreciation about like what happens in many other countries, that when you develop a technology from a concept to a prototype level, or maybe a little high, if you look around at the research R&D organizations across the country in different areas, it is not necessarily about oil and gas. You can go to nuclear establishments like BARC. You get to see that there are a lot of technologies, there are a lot of offshoot technologies which are actually viable, which are actually waiting for them to really become commercialized. Now, the efforts, something like commercialization accelerator efforts, those kind of efforts purely with a focus to take the technology to society is something that is really needed. Why it is needed? Because most of the time what happens is that let's take off a technological institute. I came from IISc, Dr. Pant is there from IIT. A technology is developed. It is developed to a certain level where it proves all the technical conditions. It proves all the the marketable requirement conditions. But then it has to be scaled up to a meaningful scale when it becomes really starts making sense for a commercial entity to look at it. Now that scaling up, the way it has grown up to that point, and from there the scaling up, like what has happened in the case of Invax, that is very important. That last phase, or typically if you technically call it a TRL level scales, that the technologies typically come to 6 or 7 TRL levels, and beyond 6, 7 to going to 9, that is a challenge. It is a challenge across the world. But then there are various accelerator initiatives which has come into place. Now that is something, if as a country level we can do that, that will be fantastic, and that would really bring about the kind of the confidence on the technology, on the product, whether we want to address it that way or take it. So I feel that's very important.
If I may just add one word on China, it's a use case of them trying to be self-sufficient, right? And I think India has a lot in common there, because China also has huge coal reserves. So they're pioneering coal to olefins technology. But see, you have to be careful what you wish for to some extent, because the thing about coal to olefin technology is relative to other kinds of olefin production. It's actually very expensive capital-wise, very intensive. And the other thing is that it's usually located in areas in China where there's not a lot of water, but for this process, you need a lot of water. And then you have to treat this water. So they use something like 2,500 metric tons an hour, right? And then after you treat that, then you add up all the capex and the cost and everything, and then you still wondered, if it's potentially worth it. Right now, for variable costs, it kind of is. But over time, you might sort of see that the environmental impact is big enough that they can't just double their CTO capacities again, right? And I think India, if I understand correctly, is also facing water shortages. And so the use of water for industrial versus agriculture is going to be a fairly major factor in deciding whether these CTO plants has a place. And this is on top of what Dr. Pant said about the need to deal with high ash coal and other idiosyncrasies of the Indian coal industry. So that's my take on it.
I wanted to add a few points on the self-sufficiency. One of the reasons why we have been expanding our refining capacity is also to ensure that at least on the refining side, we are self-sufficient. Okay, we have always been ahead of our demand in terms of refined products. Now, why that makes sense is that it's always easier to import crude and refine it and distribute it rather than importing finished products. There is a question, even asked of me many times, saying that how are you making such a big investment when you don't even know whether the world is going to remain the way it is. Now, one of the reasons I'm saying is if a country like India starts importing huge quantities of finished products like gasoline or gas oil, the international prices of gasoline and gas oil will go through the roof. One of the things is that crude we can import even from, South America or Mexico or something like that economically, whereas product imports will be mostly happening from nearby geographies. So that is one of the reasons why we have been focusing on self-sufficiency of refining capabilities. But having said that, how are we really going to become overall self-sufficient is, we have to take a multiplicity of steps. It's quite possible that India will continue to import crude, but how can we reduce or lessen the impact of the importation is through a variety of ways. Of course, the primary thing is to put more exploration areas, which is what the government is doing now. If you are able to get more of production of oil and gas within the country, that's the best that can happen. But energy efficiency is another very, very key issue in this. Maybe 2-3% of savings you can get only in terms of energy efficiency. So here we need to get across to the same point that it is not enough if you produce Euro 6 fuels or BS6 fuels. It is also necessary for Euro 6 vehicles to use it. You can't use the old model vehicles with the new model of fuels and try to get the same amount of emissions or complain about the emissions. So that is another thing. The other major area where India is focused on today is how do you convert waste to energy. I think there's an enormous potential on this. There are several experts sitting here in this room. Probably the next session also you will see some of these discussions. There's an enormous potential for converting waste, and it has got plenty of benefits. One thing is it, of course, makes our cities and towns cleaner, but it also converts this garbage into gold, literally. So people talk about circular economy and so on, and there are several ways in which entrepreneurs can develop. And these are not necessarily huge centralized plans of billions of dollars. They are small investments in a decentralized way which can serve the nearby areas, and that is one model which will work. I can tell you another small example which we did in IOC when I used to be there. We did solarization of retail outlets. People will think, what is the big thing about putting some solar panels on petrol pumps? One is, some of them even objected, saying that it goes against the concept of this business itself. Now, you want to sell diesel, but then you are wanting to control. See, you must realize that India is a very large country, and when we started this experiment in around 2009 or 10, what used to happen was there were large amounts of power cuts in several of these places, rural India and all that. So even if you have a petrol pump, the guy will not be able to operate the petrol pump because 10 hours in a day he will not have power, or quality power will not be available. So with that interest, we started the solarization of petrol pumps. Today, probably India is one country where maximum amount of solarization of retail outlets, or petrol pumps as you call it, has happened across the world. In fact, I remember there was a World Bank team which wanted to study this model. Now, this is a totally decentralized thing. Each one will be 3 kilowatt, 5 kilowatt and all that. But if you see about 20,000-30,000 pumps together have converted to solar thing, you will see how many megawatts have been converted. It's a huge thing which has happened, and all these stations which have gone into solarization are extremely happy, because one thing is they are ensured of quality power, which also does not hamper the working of the electronic machines today. It's no more those old mechanical pumps which you see. Everywhere it is electronics, and you have cards and things like that, even in the petrol dispenser. So if you don't have quality power, those gets impacted. So in our company earlier, we have studied that in terms of maintenance, it makes a big difference. The cost of maintenance has come down substantially because of solarization. And in most of the cases, the investment has been got back within a matter of 1 to 2 years. So this is what it is. So we need to look at decentralized way of generating energy sources, and which can be used. There are lots of examples. All of you are social media wise also. Many of these, many of them may be fake, but at least some of them have got some merit.
That's a very interesting point of view, and that's actually true. I mean, you cannot expect only a handful of people to do it. I mean, that's always happens. That's why the companies are set up. But a decentralized or a distributed generation aspect is a very key. I know we are running a little out of time. I just want to ask the organizer: do we have time for one more question before we open up, or? Okay, great. So I just want to have one question, and I think Yi-Jeng, you were talking about it on China and taking up CTO and how it has impacted. But kind of drawing a parallel from what Mr. Ashok was saying, that how it can be done at a decentralized level, and entrepreneurs can come up and look at waste to energy, can look at putting in solarization, ensuring energy efficiency, right? Like how LED bulbs are coming up in India, right? So what has China done around that? So for example, one aspect is this whole tin pot refining. Now that is not efficient, but methanol to olefins or methanol to gasoline, right? What are some of those elements that China has done from a technology standpoint, but more importantly on the business enabler standpoint to really, because you have to feed billions, right? India is trying to feed billions and you're trying to feed more than 1 billion, right? So what are some of the learnings from there?
So China has done things mostly through a centralized approach because in a sense that's their core strength and weaknesses both. It's state-led industries that are able to essentially crack that CTO kind of scenario. One area, though, that private industry has a huge part to play is in the automobile sector. China is the largest electric vehicle market in the world now, and it wasn't the case even a few years ago. So there's so many different kinds of electric vehicles that because of private investment. And now they're reaching a point potentially where they have to consolidate a little bit because there's just too many of them. But it's potentially a good problem to have because it allows the best technology to kind of grow to the forefront. And that's one area where I think India has always been decently strong in the sense of the smaller entrepreneurial mindset of the Indian population. In that sense, there could be some parallels to be drawn from there. But again, the issue with something like electric vehicles is you need strong grids. And this goes to what the other panelists have been saying about the need for smart grids, the need to integrate renewable energies into the mix. Solar, you can't just turn solar power on and off, right? You just wait for the sun to come, and it's an intermittent energy. So those are some of the issues that needs to be resolved first. The other interesting thing is actually from a friend of mine from a GM of Indian Oil Corporation who said something very interesting to me. He said, look, it's great that if India can become more electrified and has better vehicles, but did you ever consider that, during the monsoon season, right, in Mumbai, and the fact that most electric vehicles have the battery at the bottom of the vehicle, doesn't it? So, I mean, there are some things that needs to be potentially normalized for India because, India's got its own set of challenges. And he just rightly pointed out that you've got to solve that first, maybe make it waterproof, right? The other thing is that now you have all these batteries essentially parked in every garage. Maybe you can use that as a storage unit for the intermittent energies. So a lot of these things come together as well, and there are a lot of opportunities potentially for India, but they also need to get organized around it.
Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. So I think India needs to solve its own specific problems while it can learn from others. My last question is kind of centering back on the customer. I think Yi-Jeng, you talked about how China has, in a sense, privatized or decentralized the electric vehicle market, right? So the question, and this is to you, Mr. Ashok, and Mr. Bansal, maybe you can respond as well, is how do we create that demand, right? So for example, how do you ensure that there is that plastic processor, that plastic converter, there is that petrochemical park? PCPIR has been a concept for ages that the government has been pushing.
Businesses to actually get good technology into large companies. It takes perhaps many years. Your colleague actually, now responsible for IOC, has had those difficulties for years. People don't automatically volunteer to be the first. In fact, one major company I've worked with always used to say, we will always be the first to be second. That is to say, everybody else will do it first. You've got a major project on for 10 years now, and you want to be at the forefront of that in 10 years' time with the best technologies. Will you actually have the ability within your company to look globally at technologies and select those? Or will that actually be down to the contractor who will want to sell you the same thing as he sold everybody else at least risk?
Well, you must realize that we are a high capex industry and a high risk industry. So traditionally the approach has been that unless there is someone with a proven technology, we will not utilize. But having said that, I said in my earlier comments also that we are trying to build a project which will last the next 50, 100 years and not based on the past 50 years. So this is the mindset that I am trying to drive in our company also. And when it comes to that, we have to start looking even at our contracting procedures and the conditions in the contract. We have started looking at that. Okay. So if you are not going to implement anything which is futuristic, then our investment will be a historical investment, if I may call it that way. So we are prepared to look at future, but however, we also need to understand the risks because it's going to be huge investments. So there are certain models where we are saying that if somebody comes up with a new technology, what are the ways that we can look at in terms of sharing the risks or mitigating the risks? So if a technology provider is prepared to apportion a risk onto himself, why not? In my earlier company, we were able to take that risk and then implement some of the technologies which our own R&D developed. Earlier, the mindset even within the company was that, no, how can we use this, how can we risk it? So today, the company has benefited by utilizing several of the technologies developed by the R&D center. So I think that mindset change will have to happen. But at the same time, technology providers also should understand the fact that with large capex investments made by these industries, it is necessary for us to also to own up for the performance and for sharing some of the risks. So I think that's the way to go forward.
I can only support that absolutely. What I do see more often, it's sad to say that, is that the end user is already persuaded to use technologies. But when they put out for a fixed price contract to a contractor, that contractor is not in their interest particularly to put anything else forward that in their opinion would take some degree of risk. So your analysis of good technology and having a group of people to look at that, I would highly appreciate.
Okay, I have one question. Mr. Ashok spoke of ecosystem. It's a good ecosystem to coexist. It's very important for the whole players in the ecosystem to coexist, and everyone needs to make a good living out of it, the companies. So if you notice last a decade, we might have seen a lot of EPC companies going into oblivion. And I know, I don't want to name those companies here, but more than half a dozen EPC contractors are going into IBC. I think it's high time for the owners, because you have a responsibility here to see the whole ecosystem exist and it doesn't collapse, and it also doesn't reach a monopolistic situation. Maybe we spoke of technology, but maybe it's time for us to see the execution methodology and how efficient we execute project. So maybe it's not fair to say that the contractors defaulted, but there's also a responsibility for the owners to take responsibility on that to ensure things happen. We need to see benchmarking of our projects, what's stipulated and what's being done. Are we too aggressive on our schedules? Are we overambitious? And if it doesn't happen, do we really do an analysis and come out with findings so that we don't repeat as a team the same mistakes? So it's a big question, but the industry is suffering a bit.
Now, I'm aware that the EPC industry as such had gone through a bad cycle. But having said that, see, today, with all the technology talk which is happening in terms of the artificial intelligence, the ability to, create visual models and so on and so forth, I think we need to take, even as an EPC industry, one needs to take advantage of those things and ensure that many of the things that are being done are fairly fail-proof when it gets executed. Today, I think technology provides us several answers for many of the conventional problems that we have faced as an industry. So how do we maximize use of technology in terms of implementation? Let's face the fact. Speed is something which is going to be definitely one of the big parameters of measure. Okay, we can't afford to set up projects after 20 years and 30 years. And even in my project, I have been telling even the government officials that if you think that, because big companies are involved, government companies are involved, it will take 20 years for us to set up this project, forget about it. If you are not going to commission it by a reasonable time, then there is no purpose of setting up this project at all. So I think speed is something which is very important. And so how we are going to crush the times of execution is going to be one of the things which any client would want today. I mean, I would like to monetize my asset as quickly as possible because my future is uncertain. So this has to be recognized by an EPC industry as well. But technology today provides a way for us to do many things much more quickly and productively than how we used to do it conventionally. I think how we take advantage of that is left to all of us.
Thank you. I think...
Good morning, sir. Good morning, sir. I am R. Domra from ex-Indian Oil, and my specialize from, I am recognized global economy. I will focus most on global economy and Indian economy in particular. See, our ex-chairman, Mr. Ashok, has been telling about the alternative. I am going to tell that the same thing. Alternate energy is going to come in a big way in India, because lot of focus area we are already working in Indian Oil. See, Paradip refinery, we are just talking about, we are fully, the township is fully by solar, even plant is getting solarized. And not only that, alternate energy also we are going to have these electric vehicles and all. Lot of efforts are being done to make our petrol pumps, electric charging stations, gas coming as the fuel, gas because it's 50% cheaper. Even biogas will be still cheaper, is what I understand. So these are a lot of national drive. We are going to that. In fact, we are going to other countries also, making the plants, installations of the refineries, or we are doing only to ensure that the fuel is cheaper and cheaper. So my only understanding is, and in fact my question to Mr. Huang from China, what exactly you have been doing in China so that now we are coming number 2 in the global economy? And what necessarily we can do as a tie-up with China so that India and Indian Oil will take a lead. Of course, we have been taking a lead and we will continue to take the lead. So what you are going to suggest for this? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm actually from Taiwan, but I'm totally kidding. Like, it's fine. Regarding your question, I think part of it is for the Indian government and its people to try to understand what is it that they want and to have some political consensus. As a fellow democratic country, we understand that getting the citizens to all agree to the same thing is very, very difficult. And the government as well as the industry leaders have a role to play in terms of trying to figure out what is the overall direction. All the things I heard here is, a great direction in terms of where to go. There needs to be money to be made for industries to be invested in something like this, but there also needs to be a way of trying to make money off of sustainability, because if the sustainability aspect is not there, then the people are also not happy as well. So these are some of the major thrusts. In regards to exciting things like electric vehicles and other upcoming trends, some of it is political in the sense of especially in terms of petrochemical technology. In the U.S., they have extensive amounts of policies that support the industry. So I completely agree with the fact that the esteemed panelists here have been saying that the Indian government also has to be a bit more proactive, maybe lessen the burden of bureaucracy a little bit for those strategic industry that's leading the way for India's future. Right? If you have all these barriers in place and entrepreneurs are really just trying to get the refinery off the ground, that is a huge disincentive for everybody. Nobody wants to be first because they have to fight through the bureaucracy to be first, right? Everybody wants to be second in the sense. But hopefully, if the government is willing and the people are willing and the industry wants to participate as well, then there could be a way to streamline these processes so that India can progress at a faster pace.
Thank you. And I think with that, we need to close. I would just want to thank the panel here. I mean, it's been a personally very enlightening and enriching session for me. I think, there's a lot of good thoughts that have come out. And, I think there's clearly a roadmap. And of course, we at KPMG work closely with many of them to kind of make sure that that does become a reality. But I think personally what I would take away is while these thoughts are there, we need to hold steadfast to them. There is a demand story, there is a lot of good work that's happening, but how do we expand it, how do we scale up, and how do we take it to the broader market out there, whether it's government support, state government support, regulatory support, and really hold fast, because I think this set of group has really come out with some good thoughts. Individually, each of them, as they take it forward as well as a broader group, I think it gives us a good lesson to really make some of this happen. So with that, thank you once again. Thank you. But it's really not taken off other than maybe in the Dahej, right? IOC is trying to do that to some extent in Paradeep. So what can we really do to generate that demand, make the demand decentralized so that it pulls through a large part of the end products, creates the demand, creates the business case? What can be really done around that?
See, one is, unlike most other countries or areas, we always used to, when we visit Singapore or say Rotterdam or US and all that, we always know that there is a huge supporting ecosystem which is around. We have talked about clusters. I think even Michael Porter has talked about cluster development and so on. We have a huge oil and gas industry in India, but we don't have the supporting industries. I mean, today, if you need a specialized valve, somebody is doing the foundry work in Europe and somebody does the finishing work in USA, and then by the time we get the valve, it takes 1.5 years for us. So it's not that we order and get things immediately. So there is a case for building up a huge supporting ecosystem in the country. And one of the things, even in our project that we are proposing, is that it's a very, very large project. So we need to make sure that there is a cluster of industries which are getting developed around it. Some of the policies which have been implemented in the past have not really given the desired results because, the policy does not really incentivize the person to come in and set up the industry. So when we develop this sort of a mega project, it is possible for us to have a fresh look at the whole thing and ensure that concurrent with the development of the anchor project, the downside or the supporting industries also get launched along with it as a cluster. So that's the thing which we need to develop. And talking about the cluster, we also need to provide them with certain amount of benefits or incentives or the ecosystem required. For example, we need to make sure that most of these industries are able to come and plug in and play, which means if there is power requirement, water requirement, land requirement, all those things are pre-decided, and each of those smaller or medium industries or even some large industries are not left to fend for themselves to get over all these approvals in place. So that is something which we are trying to sell as a concept, saying that give a centralized authority so that one is everybody goes to a single window. The second thing is, as an anchor, we also take care of our requirements plus factor in some additionality for the downstream industry development. So that is one side of it. The second thing is in terms of the technology support which we need to give. There is an R&D which needs to be set up to ensure that applications are driven. Even the IOC, which is fairly successful now, is most of the petrochemicals have actually found acceptance only because of the product application center, which has been, it's a sort of an extended R&D where you demonstrate to a potential producer that these are the products that can be made and these are the advantages, etc. So that sort of a technical support or technology support is also required to be given. Similarly, financial support in terms of the banking and financial institutions. So all these things need to be built up around an ecosystem so that people can come and set up their units. And of course, the last point is that what they produce should also be responsible products. So again, you need to have that mindset that the products which are being produced are also going to ensure that the world is not going to become a worse place and it becomes a better place. And similarly, large-scale plastic producers, I believe, should also factor in as an extension to their industry, how do we ensure that the recycling happens, so that you are able to get up again a sustainable model in terms of the plastic usages. So these things need to be worked out, and we need to find the economic model in which the whole thing works and develop a cluster of industries so that the whole thing takes shape in a better way.
No, absolutely, Mr. Bansal.
Manas, what Mr. Ashok has said, I'm adding to that. Mr. Ashok has said something, how to have a further downstream, facilities to ensure that whatever polymers are coming from the petrochemical, they are used, there is a scope to utilize them. There is a system to see that these are consumed and ultimately reaching the customer. But I would like to add, sir, here one more thing, that from the refinery, when we integrate petrochemical, polymer is definitely one stream, but not the only stream with the refineries. You may find that refineries can produce perhaps endless number of chemicals from their own configuration, and there is a concept called zero residue refinery. Everything is converted into the chemicals only. You may convert to them ethanol, methanol, acetic acid, sulfuric acid, even solvent, alcohols, or even you can name anything, industrial coolant, special oils. So there is a complete spectrum of petrochemicals which can be produced from the refineries, along with the polymers, which are of course main you can say output from the petrochemicals. So refineries have to, when they design themselves, when they see, they have to be very sure that yes, they are having a flexible configuration, not only integrating polymers, but also other fine chemicals and as much as zero residue refinery concept. Then you will find that definitely the refineries will have a better flexibility as far as marketing of the various chemicals and outputs are concerned, and they will be in a better position to see that if one market is behaving slightly, you can say on a cyclic pattern, the others are available, and they can still go ahead with that and get their margins also properly. But having said that, in the rising economy, if these the downstream facilities with proper incentives and proper ecosystems are not available, the whole thing perhaps may not come true as far as refining is concerned. But we are very sure, Mr. Ashok said in the opening remarks itself, 11 kg per capita versus 33 kg per capita. So there is a lot of scope available, and as and when the markets will evolve, things have to come. Government has to put the policies in place. Otherwise, you may find that we are not reaching anywhere.
Thank you, Mr. Bansal. I think you summarized quite well the overall theme that India demand is strong, right? I think which Mr. Ashok started off with. B, there is a lot of technology evolution that's happening. It's about commercializing them. How do you get the right enablers in place? So a lot of the tools are in our hands if we just put our heads together. We're not saying there are challenges. We do need to learn from what China has done, as Yi-Jeng said, but we need to kind of put our heads together, know what the problems are, be very clear about the solutions. If it is product portfolio and how do you become a zero residue refinery, or design in terms of an integrated refinery with refinery, petchem plus biorefinery. So a lot of the tools and choices are in our hands, but how we do that planning and how do we execute can ensure that some of those downstream technology or what we might call downstream 4.0 is truly a reality for India, and you can actually craft it. India can craft it itself to a large degree. So let me close here and open it up to the audience if there are any questions. I think we can probably take one or two questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much for an excellent discussion. My first question is to Mr. Ashok, really. You talked about the decentralized proposition. Does safety become a concern for you, or do you feel that we have regulation and compliance which is good enough to ensure that these projects are operated with levels of safety that we've been used to in the oil and gas industry?
No, safety, of course, is absolutely important, and I think we don't have a great record in terms of safety consciousness. But having said that, at least in the oil sector, we are pretty I mean, well versed with it. I mean, you know that even the LPG distribution is that way a little difficult, but then we have made sure that the safety consciousness is there. When millions of customers are using the cylinders and all that, they need to be taught how to use it safely and so on. So the same, I mean, we will, when we design the overall model, we will have to certainly factor in the aspect of safety requirements as well as, effective disposal of anything which is unutilized in any of these plants. You know, when you even have waste to energy conversion, there's some material which will always get disposed. And the record of such disposals are actually not very good. So we need to overall work out a system wherein things get addressed in the proper way. And definitely I think because we are worried about safety, we will not go into a decentralized model, should not be the approach, rather than fix the safety issue and go in for a decentralized approach.
Thank you. My second question is to the gentleman from S&P, Mr. Huang.
Can I request you to introduce yourself before you ask the question so that for the general audience, can I just request?
Okay. Yeah, my name is Amitabh Kumar. I'm with the American Chambers of Commerce. You talked about, just a clarification, sir. You talked about reduction in transportation fuels from 25% to 21% up to 2050. Just a clarification, this 4%, is it an impact of EVs? And if it is, which sector of transportation is it impacting? And just a related question, you talked about petrochemicals moving up from 13% to 20%. Is that a net increase? That is, do you see certain plastics and polymers being phased out and certain new ones recyclable and biodegradable replacing them? Or is it just a sort of a total increase? So just on those two, please. Thank you. Clarification.
That's a multi-part question. I'll try to answer best I can. So regarding transportation fuel, you have to also realize in terms of percentage that the overall use of oil is still expected to increase. So the pie is getting larger, so to speak. So even though it looks like the transportation fuel percentage is definitely falling or plateauing off, maybe by then it's going to be significantly more oil used for transportation than even today. I think part of the reason why it's plateauing off is because of the advent of electric vehicles, right? Because electric vehicles, the electricity and the power is generated from a central station somewhere and then put into your car batteries. So there's potentially less need to cart around gasoline in a car traditionally, right? So that's where that loss potentially comes from. In terms of the rise of different kinds of petrochemicals, I think it's, there's actually a lot of experts in this panel here, but I believe that it's fairly broad-based. Many kinds of petrochemicals such as PE, PP, plastics, different kinds, PET, bottles, as well as other sort of petrochemicals, scales up with the GDP. And we're expecting that in developing countries, especially areas like India, which is leading the GDP charge, that as the GDP rises, then the population will use more plastics, etc. Therefore, there's a broad-based increase of different kinds of petrochemicals as well, if that answers your question, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, good morning to you. My name is Martin Goff from Calgary in the UK. This is probably to all of your members, but in particular, Mr. Ashok. It's never easy, and it's particularly not easy for a small